Welcome everybody. My name's Rebecca Bailey. I'm Programme Director of Towards National Collection, and I have a post-COVID voice, which I'm told is very sexy, but I would definitely reserve judgment on that. So apologies if I'm coughing and sneezing. I will make sure and mute myself if I do. So it's great to see you all on such a lovely day. Well, it's warm and sunny outside Edinburgh. I'm sure some of you are absolutely roasting, but I hope you've got a breeze. This is our final session where we're going to hear from our foundation projects. So we're very pleased to have 3 of our projects with us this afternoon, one postponed from an earlier date. Thank you, Rachel, for coming back. So we're going to start this afternoon with Pip Willcox from the National Archives, talking about the Engaging Crowds project. She's going to be followed by Gethin Rees from the British Library, talking about locating a national collection. And then Rachael Kotarski, also from the British Library, is going to talk about the Persistent Identifiers project. We're going to run the presentations immediately one after the other, but please do register your questions in the chat. And then when we have the Q&A at the end, you can ask questions of any of the presenters. But if we've got a few questions loaded up in the chat already, that will help us. You'll notice at the moment that only the speakers can be seen on screen, but if you do want to ask your question in person later, don't worry, Javier has the power to allow you to put your camera and mic on, but during the presentations, we'll keep you switched off for the moment. Javier, is there anything else I need to tell people? No, they've been notified that we're recording the session?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes. So.
Okay, super. Then I'm going to hand over to Pip to share her screen.
Hello, can you both hear me and see the screen?
Yes, it's now on full view. We can see it.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Zoom just doing slightly odd things unusually. Excellent. Thank you very much, Rebecca, and Javier and Ariadna for organising us all today. And thanks to everyone who's come to listen. I've found this series of seminars fascinating, so I hope today follows suit for you all. I'm sure the other speakers will be, because I know their projects well and they're fabulous. So we're so grateful for the opportunity to have researched this project. You'll have gathered by now that Engaging Crowds was one of the foundation projects funded through Towards a National Collection, or TANC, itself an Arts and Humanities Research Council programme funded through the Government Strategic Priorities Fund. I imagine everyone here holds dear the importance of our heritage, the importance of linking it, using all the amazing technologies we have to share it around the country and the world, of bringing new perspectives to bear on it that will enrich our shared cultural life and feed into the wider economy. And this is seen as a national priority, and that makes me happy. So to me, heritage is important as long as it is important, which is to say relevant, useful, challenging, inspiring to people, to us. And that's what this programme celebrates. So the Engaging Crowds project explored citizen research in cultural heritage, people using digital, usually web-based technologies to contribute to knowledge about collections. At its best, citizen research can create a virtuous circle of participation and shared new knowledge about our national collection. Members of the public can engage with collections deeply and richly, developing and sharing their expertise and building meaningful relationships with our heritage. Cultural heritage practitioners can select collections of focus, including those that have been underrepresented or overlooked. Heritage organisations benefit from the new insights produced through these projects, feeding new knowledge into shared digital resources such as catalogues or digital archives. But this virtuous circle requires energy to keep its momentum. Crowdsourcing relies on the generosity of citizen researchers donating their time and skills to projects. It relies on collections and digital infrastructures, including people's expertise, for crowdsourcing platforms, collections digitization, project design, ongoing engagement with the public throughout the life of a project, and undertaking to use the data that is produced well. And this generosity is at the heart of what these projects rely on. It is these projects, and it demands an ethical approach to be at their heart. So those of us who breathe, maybe, perhaps who engage with the world digitally, are aware of the damage we do to each other, to our communities, and to our societies using web-based technologies. For me, the wonder of crowdsourcing of citizen research is that it exists at all, and that it flourishes, and it merits more research. The aims of our project, our Engaging Crowds project, the overarching question was how to understand how crowdsourcing or citizen research in cultural heritage works, where the bumps are, and look for ways to go about ironing them out. Can we make citizen research more engaging for volunteers? And at a similar time to our work, another project took a different approach to some of these questions, and I'd highly recommend the book it produced of the practice of crowdsourcing, if this is an area of interest to you. So this that was Collective Wisdom. Sorry, funny audio thing happened there. And the Collective Wisdom project was led by 3 brilliant crowdsourcing practitioners: Mia Ridge of the British Library, Megan Ferreter of the Library of Congress, and Sam Blicken of the Adler Planetarium. Sam was also part of our project, and it was funded by the UK-US Digital Scholarship Scheme by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK and the National Endowment for the Humanities in the States. And it brought together practitioners in a book sprint, and that book is the result. I was one of its co-authors, and if you'll forgive the plug, it's highly readable and full of, well, collective wisdom. So our project team, which is here, the slide that's up now, it grew as we went. Some of the people in it moved on to other roles, and others became incorporated into our project because the work that they were doing complemented ours. Whether or not they were formally part of the project, I'd like to acknowledge their work, which has helped enrich our joint endeavours. So the partnership was made up of 3 cultural heritage organisations, 3 independent research organisations: the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh, Royal Museums Greenwich, and the National Archives, where I'm based. And our university partner was the Zooniverse team at the University of Oxford. We benefited also enormously from the wisdom and guidance of our brilliant advisory board too. So I'll turn now to our activities. If you'd like to hear about them in more detail, there are other talks available online, including a Tank Towards National Collection seminar from last year. So this is a brief overview. For those of you who don't know, Zooniverse has a crowdsourcing platform that's free for anyone to use. And as part of this project, their developers created a tool to enable citizen researchers to navigate their own path through a collection in our crowdsourcing projects. This code is available on their GitHub site, and it's already being used in other projects on their platform. I should note perhaps that it involves no corkscrews at all. I just love the image. But given that the entire duration of the project happened during lockdown, we were never all together in one room, let alone a room with wine. We ran 3 citizen research projects through the overarching Engaging Crowds project. These were used to iterate the navigation tool that I just mentioned and give the cultural heritage members of the project team practical insight into running a project. And they enabled us to engage firsthand with the wonderful volunteers who contributed to them. They've also, of course, created new knowledge about these 3 collections, whose data are, or will be when they're finished, freely available, as well as being fed back into our organisations. So the first was HMS NHS, the Nautical Health Service, led by Greenwich. It's based on the records of the Dreadnought Seamen's Hospital, which cared for sick and injured merchant seafarers entering the Port of London from 1826 to 1986, though that's not the span of the project, which for data protection reasons doesn't go as late as the 20th century, well into the 20th century. This project launched its first phase in June 2021 and its second in February this year. Part 1 is already complete. Part 2 is still active if you're catching the bug and want to help out. Scarlets and Blues was led by the National Archives. It launched in November 21 and was completed in January 22, and it drew upon 5 minute books of the Special Board of the Royal Hospital Chelsea from 1908 to 1919. And the third project was the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh Herbarium, exploring Gesneriaceae, the African violet family. That's also complete, having launched in January this year. It involves the transcription of selected elements of the herbarium collection, label data from the Gesneriaceae specimens. I have to say Gesneriaceae at least twice in every talk because I've learned how to pronounce it now. So we planned for 3 workshops as part of the project, one to explore each of the main practitioner and audience groups for crowdsourced data. All of these audience groups are both part of crowdsourcing projects and the groups benefiting from them. So the 3 groups were People and Machines, which explored the use of artificial intelligence in the process of crowdsourcing and crowdsourcing data to train machine learning. After the crowds disperse, the second workshop looked at the uses organisations put crowdsourced data to, and the voices of the volunteers, that's the last one there, explored the experience of contributors to crowdsourcing projects. The additional workshop that we ran was part of Discovering Collections, Discovering Communities, a conference that ran in, or last year's version of the conference, which is running again next week. And this drew on the experiences of delegates at the conference, which serves the glamour community, so galleries, libraries, archives, museums, and academia. And we gathered their experiences together as part of this. And finally, we reached out to the wider community through surveys, through an open call, asking cultural heritage projects to share their experiences with us. We also circulated a survey to participants in our 3 citizen research projects that I mentioned earlier. 379 people took part in this, and the results indicated that we had many active volunteers who valued the opportunity to make a contribution to citizen research. Feedback on the indexing tool, the navigation tool, was generally positive, with some volunteers being unsure about its function, but others appreciating the increased agency that they had compared to other projects they'd experienced. And we took a quantitative view of volunteer activity, and this analysis focused on questions around the time of volunteer contribution and the number of active volunteers on each project. So for each of these workshops and surveys, we've written a report, as well as the formal final report that conforms to the same pattern as our sibling foundation projects. I'm afraid COVID has once again reared its head and delayed their publication, so I can't share the URLs for them here yet. They'll be coming very soon on the Tank website, and we're really grateful to Rebecca and Javier for their work to get them published. We've also created a data sharing platform where you'll shortly be able to find the data from each of these projects in one place, as well as, for example, in our catalogues in due course. And our code is available through GitHub. So throughout this project, we've explored best practice in citizen research, the experience of volunteers, and the challenges and potential facing practitioners in the field. Our findings can help to enhance the efficacy and impact of citizen research in the cultural heritage sector, foregrounding its ethics and paving the way for a future national and supranational citizen research effort. We go into much more detail and share our evidence in the reports I mentioned earlier, and this is a summary which will be an overview only. So don't underestimate the time and resource needed to set up and run a crowdsourcing project. They're often imagined to achieve a specific short-term goal that wouldn't be possible without the help of volunteer work, but that is far from meaning it doesn't require organisational effort too. So make sure someone is advocating for the volunteer experience as well throughout the design phase. Project teams need to think about the format and quality of data that would be most useful and design their project to support volunteers to produce this. Task variety and flexibility within a project is important for encouraging a wide range of people to take part. Projects with short, simple tasks that can be fitted into different moments of the day have the best chance of engaging a large number of volunteers, but this can be hard when our heritage collections can be complex or ambiguous. The best projects will be open to surprises as volunteers respond to collections. This may involve recasting the project in light of early feedback. Rigorous testing is essential, and continual adjustments to the project throughout its life. Long-term sustainability is, of course, important. We need to answer questions such as how long will the project remain active? Are the colleagues available to support it? How will the outputs of the project be made publicly available? And what resources are needed to make this happen? For all these aspects, projects need support from across organisational structures, and senior sponsorship can be very helpful in facilitating this, especially across the lifetime of a longer project. Questions around digitising collections were out of scope for this project, but we know that this is a prerequisite for many of the types of project we explored. Digitisation itself requires resource, and how it is funded may influence its licensing for reuse. Tank has commissioned and published a report by Andrea Wallace on copyright and open access, which I recommend if you haven't already read it. And there's a seminar as well that's available that Andrea led. Licensing and copyright requirements need to be discussed early and communicated clearly in citizen research projects, embracing the use and the later reuse of digitised collections and the data created by volunteers. So there may be challenges to navigate around image rights where organisations use images to generate income. Information on how to download and use data by a project will empower those with less technical expertise to access it and reuse it for their own interest. Citizen research projects enable volunteers to make a huge contribution to the cultural heritage field, and this contribution must be clearly acknowledged in a prominent place on project websites and wherever this data is reused. The ethical and legal requirements to protect any potentially identifying information from volunteers also need consideration. With technology advancing rapidly, the question of how far to integrate automated approaches into citizen research is urgent. Machine learning can perform tasks perceived as tedious, freeing volunteers to channel their skills into more interesting challenges that machines can't perform. Is it ethical to ask volunteers to complete tasks that could be undertaken by machines? Perhaps not, but some volunteers find enjoyment in simple tasks. Project tasks need to be engaging for volunteers, and the requirements for machines can't be prioritised over those of people. So only certain types of data and tasks are appropriate, both technically and ethically. Many organisations don't have the technical infrastructure and knowledge to support this kind of work, and the same tools will not fit with every project. Any tools that are used need complete transparency and explanations. Volunteers can then give informed consent and ideally would have the possibility of opting out even within the same project that uses automation. Machine learning models ought to be shared publicly with documentation on model generation, datasets and tooling to support them. We'd like to see a shared platform for this across cultural heritage beyond simply citizen research. Volunteers are motivated to participate in citizen research by a range of factors, and an interest in the subject matter and affinity with the project mission is shared by many of them. Volunteers value regular communication from project teams, as this can foster the sense of community, receiving feedback on their work and understanding why their contribution matters, and enabling them to share their thoughts on the project. Many volunteers also enjoy talking to each other, so try to include a forum within a project. And citizen research projects are as much about outreach and participation as they are about data creation. This is sometimes overlooked by organisations. Project teams need to consider how they can have a positive impact on volunteers rather than simply relying on their labour, such as by providing them with opportunities to develop new skills, share their experience, give them agency and have fun. And best practice in citizen research is to make volunteer outputs and source materials used in the project freely available for use and reuse in multiple formats. Where there may be delays in reusing data within organisations, for example, in their collections management systems, projects may need to consider alternative ways to share data, for example, through a repository. We engage in crowdsourcing because we care about the collections and the community. This work, paid or voluntary, involves commitment and emotional labour. The ethics of crowdsourcing must be at the front of our minds. They inform our values, which are evident in every aspect of our work, from first reaching out to a community to sharing the final data. Citizen research is not a cheap option for cataloguing. It's an opportunity to develop and nurture sustained relationships of mutual benefit between collections and the public, and requires ongoing resources from across organisations. To create a unified virtual national collection, as Tanka set out to do, we need to create and understand collections data so we can make links and create new knowledge. Crowdsourcing can help hugely with this. And by definition, crowdsourcing supports TANK's aim to increase public access beyond the physical boundaries of collections locations. It can contribute towards becoming more inclusive, redressing the demographic and geographic imbalance in our cultural heritage, while mindful not to place a further burden on groups who are and have historically been underrepresented. At the last TANK seminar I gave, I started by talking about knowledge infrastructures, and that's where I'd like to leave you this time. When done well, deliberately, with care and thought, crowdsourcing can be a jewel in our knowledge infrastructure. With the technologies we have today and that we continue to develop and use in and beyond our national collection, experts and audiences are not mutually exclusive. Quite the opposite, in that they overlap and merge as co-creators. And this co-creation, this co-ownership of our shared heritage is a vital part of what makes our national collection. Thank you, and I'm sorry if you can hear the demolition work that's just started next door.
Thank you very much, Pip. I've been very recently reviewing Pip's final report and really enjoyed it. Lots and lots of interesting data in there, and it will be coming very, very soon. We promise, very soon. So thank you very much. Let the demolition continue. We shall move on now and invite Gethin to share his screen and tell us about locating a national collection.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my slides. Can you see that and hear me?
We can only see and hear you, not your presentation so far.
Okay. Hold on a sec. Let me. How about now?
Yep, that's it. Sorted.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much. Thanks, Pip, and thanks to the Tank team. Yep. I'm nice to see you all here. And yeah, one of the sad things about finishing up with Tank is that I won't be able to use this incredibly snazzy PowerPoint intro slide here. So yeah, thanks for that too. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about locating a national collection. And from the outset, I just wanted to stress that what I'll be talking about is a collaborative endeavor. Thanks particularly to our researchers, Stephen and Valeria, and to Rainer at the Austrian Institute of Technology, who was our development partner, Rainer Simon. And also big thanks to some staff at the BL. Hi, Adi, I think you're here. Thanks to Adi Kynan-Schoenbert, and also to Victoria Morris. So our project began with the objectives of the Towards a National Collection project, and we saw our project as aiming to meet a couple of these, primarily two of these objectives. At least in the presentation today, I'll be mainly covering two, and that is public access and engagement. And in looking at this objective, we sought to explore how locations offer powerful connections between the public and collections. Secondly, we looked to address this objective of to improve digital search and cataloging tools. And there we found that location data is an effective method of dissolving barriers between collections and providing a generous map interface to these collections. And we also addressed research capability. I'll be touching on that a little bit today, but you know, time is a bit short too. So moving on. These are the project partners for locating a national collection. And the key distinction in our project partners is that between GLAMs, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, and those that manage the historic environment. Now, the collections of GLAMs particularly contain objects, whereas the collections of historic environment organizations generally contain are site-based. So both their digital records contain geographical information of different types. And our project's hypothesis is that the geographical information provides an effective way to connect these two types of collections. And so I'll just give you a quick example here. Here's Lindisfarne. Two of our project partners manage visitor sites on Lindisfarne. And of course, the Lindisfarne Gospels are in the collections of the British Library. Now, there has been attempts, this year, the Lindisfarne Gospels will be traveling up to the Northeast for a temporary exhibition. But our project was also interested in how this context could be reconstructed digitally and how that might impact on different types of audiences and how we might derive value from the placement of these objects within the context of the historic environment. Now, this is also of great relevance to the cultural heritage sector, or as we see here, a subset of larger organizations from the cultural heritage sector in the UK, these independent research organizations that are able to apply for funding from the research councils. And we see the division here between GLAMs and historic environment as a key distinction. And so the project's first recommendation really would be that the National Collection should connect GLAMs and historic environment data. And this is something we've really explored through our engagement work package. Now, that engagement work package addresses this objective of public access and engagement, and was a collaboration between British Library, the National Trust, and Historic Royal Palaces. But today we'll be focusing on the work of the National Trust and a market research company called ResearchBods. So our second work package was slightly pompously titled Infrastructure Work Package, but this is essentially was a technical work package where we developed apps in order to test the approaches that we scoped in the engagement work package. And so that was really hands-on practical development that was driven by these user or audience scoping that we did in the engagement work package. And that was thanks to that was drawing on the work and moving the work of the Pelagios network forward, and thanks to project co-investigator Leif Isaacson for his help there. Okay, so we'll begin with the engagement work. Now, this engagement work sought to examine attitudes to cultural heritage, behaviors around history and heritage, and values, place, and geography. And we had a threefold methodology here in order to examine this examine public audiences to explore their attitudes. And that involved quantitative work, and we had, in terms of our public audience work, we had a survey with 992 members of the general public who were representative of the UK population. And then we moved on to a qualitative phase. Here we had 4 focus groups where we really got to explore some of those findings, of those early indications of audience motivation that we had in the quantitative work in more detail there. And finally, we went on to use a set of prototypes within the focus groups. Now, these are simple sketches of interface ideas, consisting of a few PowerPoint slides, and they acted as a stimulus for discussion. And with this stimulus, we asked participants what they would do if they saw an interface like this, where they would click, what their reactions are to it. And it gives a clear path between this audience research and interface design, in a clear path between our audience findings and the technical exploration we were going to do. And so that would be our second recommendation, is that the infrastructure design for a national collection should be informed by a set of actionable audience motivations. And I have a quote from Norman here: "How do you know you solved the correct problem?" So we found the prototype approach an excellent way into this question. And I'm going to explain this in a little bit more detail through a case study of one of the such audience motivations, which is related to local heritage. Now, our survey sought to explore how the public related to local heritage. And in the initial instance, we defined this in terms of residence. And we found that 60% identified strongly with the place and local area they considered to be their home. 54% agreed that they felt well connected to the local community in the place and local area that they considered to be their home. On the other hand, a little bit higher there, 74% did state that they were interested in the history of their local area. So there's a fairly modest degree of connection amongst the UK public to where they live. And, in some sense, responses could be described as being polarized. But what does this actually mean for cultural heritage? Are those who do not feel this sense of connection to their local area uninterested in heritage related to that area? Or is there actually an opportunity here to build this sense of identity? And I would say there's been a dearth of research on how the extent to which digital approaches, and in particular web maps, can, from a geographical perspective, can perhaps impact on this area. So we then went into an open-ended discussion in our focus groups. And there we found that actually this concept of the local extends beyond people's neighborhoods and beyond their residence to encompass drivers, audience drivers, like where I live now. Well, that's what we just talked about, but where I grew up was also important, where my family came from, And so these concepts of residence, memory, or genealogy were also real drivers of curiosity amongst the public. So we went on to then design this prototype. And this allowed us, we found that in the focus group, this really drew out responses from participants. And in particular, we presented this prototype, Heritage for All, drawing inspiration from James Morley's A Street Near You. And we presented cultural heritage records from the area around where people live, taken from a broad range of UK collections. And for example, glam collections, such as Roman coins or references in documents, alongside historic environment data, such as listed buildings or scheduled monuments. And users were told that they could come to this web page, they could find something they were interested in, and click through to institutional web pages. And we really had passionate responses to this particular prototype, and with audiences discussing the places that were familiar to themselves, discussing how the presentation in this way rendered content significant to them, directed them to meaningful content. And we felt that perhaps this did tap into current behavior around local exploration at that time, when of course we were in lockdown. So our third recommendation is that the National Collection should include heritage of local significance, defined broadly and including residence, genealogy, and memory. Now, thinking on this prototype, obviously it's fine to make a PowerPoint slide, but we have to actually implement this. So in our second half of our project, we have created versions of Heritage for All. And in doing so, we really had to have a think about geographical information. Now, Heritage for All was structured similar to a geographical information system, a GIS, where each record has its own location, one object. And I'd just like to mention one aspect of this, which is precision local and location data or geographical information, and specific locations in the physical environment, such as a familiar building, a park, or a street corner, really were necessary to pique this local interest. It's this connection to a familiar location. And if we examine, for example, toponyms, that's place names that refer to a country, region, or city, they were too imprecise to be meaningful at this local scale. And for example, we have a persistent identifier here for Streatham, which was this location of our prototype. And rather, we need precise geographical information, such as addresses, grid references, postcodes, or coordinates. And there on the right, here we see St. Leonard's Church situated in Streatham, a listed building. And unfortunately, there's no persistent identifier for that church. But we really need to consider these use cases about the precision of data that's going into this national collection. Imagine if you were searching for a restaurant on Google Maps, but all the information that was returned was that the restaurant was in Streatham. That wouldn't be very useful. If we look at the British Library collections, if we have documents in the British Library, how do they resonate with this sense of local identity? Do we need data at the level of postcode, street, or neighborhood, or is town enough there? Okay, so this provides a neat seg into our technical work package. Now, this technical work aimed to explore, implement our engagement work through this practical development, and particularly through web maps. And when I say web maps, I'm talking about interactive, slippy maps, the kind of thing you might have used in terms of Google, Bing, or OpenStreetMaps. And if we look at our partners and the geographical information, what do I mean by this term geographical information? Well, if we think about GLAMs, generally their collections contain toponyms, whereas on the other hand, historic environment organizations collections metadata contain coordinates. And so each of these different types of geographical information has their advantages. Toponyms are the basis of authority files, and or gazetteers in this instance, and they facilitate text-based search. Whereas coordinates, on the other hand, offer precise locations and allow for visualization. So a single records can contain both of these, but rarely do. So if we start here with GLAM collections, how do we turn these toponyms into coordinates so that we can facilitate visualization? There's a derivation process required here. Now, this might be metadata that already exists, but it might also be the content of GLAM collections. For example, OCR text, place names on maps, which we see here, or depictions of locations, for example, in the collections of galleries. Now, there are automated and manual approaches to doing this, and then entity linking approaches that are required to align the toponym, the extracted toponyms, with authority files. So we can say that a systematic approach is required to realize this geographical potential of GLAM collections in particular, which forms our fourth recommendation. And Pelagios tools like Recogito and like the tool Locoligo, which we have created, which Stephen really created on the project, can aid with this process. And once we have these collections, once we have these coordinates, we can do some quite interesting things here with GLAM collections, as well as this kind of discovery use case I just talked about earlier. Here we see a visualization of British Library digitized collections items. Now, there are lots of problems with this sample, and so this is at the moment, and it's a fraction of the collections that we were able to extract coordinate data from, etc. But the visualization is illustrative and shows that if we are considering investment in collections of national institutions like digitization, or for example, visitor site infrastructure, should this not be geographically representative, particularly when these terms like leveling up are being used in politics a lot. And so our fifth recommendation here is that the heritage included in the national collection should be representative of the entire geography of the UK. Now, moving on here to our apps that we built in this technical work package. This is the first app we built, Peripleo, and I'm going to just play this video of the use of Peripleo. I hope you can see this. And this is a web map application to visualize data, and it's available to for anyone to create their own maps and embed them in their website and host the JSON data on GitHub pages. So that's completely free to host this. And we've done it thanks to Joe Padfield and his simple site. And here we zoom in on York, and if we can see here Clifford's Tower, and it's a discovery mechanism for the web page here of Clifford's Tower. And if we go back to the related web resources, we can see that that's been linked to Historic England, to the Portable Antiquity Scheme, and here to sound in the British Library's collections, which is that of Mr. Tickle read in a York accent, which is an absolutely brilliant sound. I really suggest you have a listen to that if you get the chance. Now, this co-contextualization of different types of collection item allows the map to really move towards this concept of place. So we move from just geographical information or coordinates to a kind of concept here by combining and contextualizing these different collection items together. Okay, now here, this is a second app that the project has produced. This is an app called Locoligo. Now, this is a geospatial data curation tool, and thanks to Stephen for this, really. And I'll just show you the video of this now too. I hope you can see it. This is the same visitor data set that we saw before. And in the app here, we can curate data. So here we see some authority files on the right, geonames, World Historical Gazetteer, and Wikidata. And the user of the app can build links here, again, between Clifford's Tower and, in this case, World Historical Gazetteer representation of York and a geonames representation of York. And you can see in the left, the JSON representation is being created, is being enriched with that gazetteer info. And then that's then available to download, and you can add that linked data to our Parapuyo web map. And at the same time here, you can make links between collection items. The portable antiquity scheme is represented there. So in this second case, with the portable antiquity scheme, the two records need not have any text in common. We can actually just make these links based on proximity to each other, of the records to each other. So it's a slightly different approach of it to entity linking available elsewhere. And it does allow for, this different approach does allow for a more contextualized idea of place. And so that moves me on to our sixth recommendation, that coordinates offer an effective method of connecting heritage, drawing connections that might not otherwise be apparent. And our project both did this manually and automated this drawing connections between authority files and records with each other. And the results can be seen here at this web page, as well as information on the two apps that we've created. Okay, so now just turning to interfaces. I probably don't have too much time left actually, but here we have search engines. And so, I have to just begin our discussion of interfaces with search engines. Our research really showed that these are a major route into the collections. And also this use of schema.org was something that we worked on quite heavily in terms of our Parapuyo app. And that has excellent provision for geographical information as well as search engine optimization. And I would really recommend cultural heritage institutions using schema.org. So moving on now to these interactive web maps, it's been a real focus of our project, and it's absolutely clear that they are well used by the public and they're embedded in all of our lives. And the uses that we find are mainly closed-ended. And so those are based on quite constrained functionality, and where navigation and information retrieval are the most popular. So we're talking about, where is this place? How can I get there? Journey planning. However, there is scope here for more open-ended objectives, more open-ended uses of web maps, of interactive web maps. COVID and electoral maps were something we looked at in our survey, and those are popular and point towards this browsing approach that's also possible. And web maps are also very cost-effective and really pretty sustainable, as opposed to many types of visualization, based on a set of well-known standards and updated across the web regularly. And so that was an important finding, and that was also tallies with the audience agency report that Tank recently commissioned, where maps are the second most requested feature. However, it's really important to stress that there are things they can be used for and things they cannot be used for. So our Parapuyo interface was designed to support a specific task, which was to help users discover cultural records, heritage records, in the form of web pages. And as we can see here, we prototype this through the example of Lindisfarne. And in this way, it could be described as a generous interface, presenting different options, a range of options to the user that they may not have considered before seeing the interface. And so, they offer an effective interface, but just in certain use cases. So we also looked at this case study based on historic environment data.
Running a bit over time, Gethin, if you can
Yeah,
Try
I'll
and
wrap it
finish
up
up.
now. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, no problem. We also looked at this historic environment use case, and we found that visualizing these patterns was quite difficult, required a more complex functionality than was required than the discovery use case, was clicking through to web pages. And so that then meant that the same interface could not be used in these two instances. So the National Collection should implement a set of interfaces based on audience motivations rather than a single interface. That's and so as it's the end of the presentation, I think it's time for a cliche. Better that an interface does one job well rather than many poorly. And you know, it's important to help a public audience to understand what their interface is used for. It could be used for from the outset. So just to conclude, I just wanted to say a word on impact. So our definition of impact has defined this as web page hits, but geographical information, and so there's been put the user in a more of a passive role. But this geographical information that we scoped does offer pathways to impact like social cohesion through shared identity or sense of belonging. And geographical information are really the building blocks of that approach. And I think would allow opportunities to reposition our understanding of a national collection from this local perspective and a user point of view. Thanks very much. Here are the project outputs. And our final report will be submitted towards the end of this month. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Gethin. I'm really looking forward to seeing your report, and you'll be my final stage of the Foundation project reports, which will be fabulous. We're going to move on now to Rachael, and Rachel's in the very happy position of having already published her report, so just slightly a little bit of COVID delay to the presentation. But Rachael, I shall hand over to you.
Lovely, thank you very much. Hello everyone, I'm Rachael Kotarski. I'm Head of Research Infrastructure Services at the British Library, and I was the PI for the Persistent Identifiers as IRO Infrastructure project, which we colloquially called Heritage PIDs because it was less of a mouthful. Yes, I was due to present in May before I myself succumbed to the dreaded virus. So thank you for squeezing me into today's session, and apologies if I'm keeping everyone from their lovely back gardens or balconies on this Friday afternoon. So before I dig into some of the detail, this project was about persistent identifiers and how we can make better use of them across the heritage sector in galleries, libraries, archives and museums. GLAM has been mentioned several times before. But I want to start out by saying that we used a very specific definition of persistent identifier. So we're not talking about system identifiers that you might get within any information catalogue collection management system, but actually this is an identifier that provides a long-lived and stable link to an object, just like the two examples on this slide, a digital object identifier or DOI, which you may be familiar with through publications, as well been used on publications for well over 20 years now. Digital publications, and the bottom one is an international standard name identifier. So this is used by libraries to disambiguate copyright holders and authors of works. And the features that our definition of a persistent identifier are threefold. So they must be actionable, in that you must be able to click on a link that contains the identifier and be able to get to that thing or something that describes that thing. It must be globally unique. So the string of letters and numbers that forms your identifier is not just unique within an organization and a collection, but actually internationally, globally, beyond institutional boundaries. And that actually those two features of your identifier must be managed to persist for the long term. So actually it needs to be globally unique now and in 100 years time. It needs to be a clickable link now and in 5, 10 plus years time as well. And these functions have specific advantages that we think are of value to the National Collection in terms of linking across siloed collections with trusted, sustainable links, developing metrics of use, etc. And if we look at our aims from the original project description, we talk about finding ways to ensure a greater uptake of persistent identifiers to make use of these advantages. But I guess the fundamental issue is this was not a new discussion when we put the project together. Discussions around what persistent identifiers should be used for collections has been going on in pockets across various collection holding organisations for well before this project. So really our question was, why are we still stuck here? What is it that we need to be able to move the conversation out of small pockets and get it on a greater agenda? So one of the things we did early on in the project was to do a survey. And we found that awareness of what persistent identifiers are and what they do wasn't necessarily the barrier we thought it was. Now, admittedly, this was a kind of self-selecting group of folks who saw that we were putting out a survey on use of persistent identifiers in heritage organisations, and probably a lot of people go, oh, I know something about that, I'll respond to that survey. Despite the fact of us trying to appeal to many of our colleagues that even if you know not of what we speak, please do try and respond to this survey so we can get a good kind of wide understanding of awareness and what the barriers are across the sector. So there's awareness of the persistent identifiers already and some of the benefits, but actually the kinds of identifiers we were talking about at that, the gold standard, if you like, of globally unique and managed for persistence, was potentially beyond some of the requirements that the organisations we were talking to needed. And actually they needed persistent identifiers to do slightly less globally challenging jobs in the nearer term. So we took that away to work into essentially a toolkit to support organisations in making the next steps, and specifically around decision making for persistent identifiers. So that's making choices such as when and where to apply an identifier, not just which ones to choose. So throughout the middle section of Heritage PIDs, we went about essentially creating that toolkit. So I can go through some of the resources that we developed. I think the main one to mention is our Developing Identifiers for Heritage Collections resource. So this is essentially a website that again makes use of Joe Padfield's simple site tool within GitHub. And here you'll find case studies that we developed of the partner organisations who've already gone some way down the path of using persistent identifiers. They are linked to recommendations of actually what is it you might want to do with persistent identifiers, and therefore which ones might you look at selecting to use as your tool to meet those aims. And this really starts from basic actions such as actually describing people, places and things within your metadata and not necessarily identifying your collection items straight at that point, through to more advanced uses of persistent identifiers that might require in-house technology support. So we really wanted to look at this pathway. What are the smallest steps organisations can take to better use of persistent identifiers to link the information they have across their own organisation, but also with others, and take those steps until we can move forward, I guess, as a wider sector. One of the other things we put together is led by Professor Rod Page, who did a demonstrator. So essentially, he looked at specimen collections, some of which already have persistent identifiers, and use those to demonstrate that when they have persistent identifiers, you can find out when and where they might have been used and referenced in the literature. So this shows how we can not only improve access for researchers from wherever they work, and I mean that in a digital space. So if researchers are using the journals or the monographs or other online resources that they are just going to continue to use anyway, if we can embed our collections and links to them within those spaces, we can draw them towards using our collections for research. But we can also then understand how those collections are used in their workflows and publications. So if we have a globally unique identifier, we can do something as simple as doing a Google search for that identifier and finding out where it's mentioned. So that could be in the literature, in blogs, it could potentially be in tweets, etc. So that really helps us identify who's using it, as well as encouraging more people to use our collections if they're linked with persistent identifiers. One of the other things that we created towards the end of the project is actually our own policy at the British Library on use of persistent identifiers. So we wanted to have an internal document mainly, although there is a public version, as you'll see from here. We have an external and an internal version, mostly because the internal version talks about which group of people you need to go to for sign off and this, that and the other. That's not really interesting to people externally. It's not there's anything secret, and if you really wanted to see that extended version, I can send it to you. But yeah, the interesting content is all contained within the external version of the policy. But it talks about what we want to try and use at the British Library within our systems, what we should support, and how we can build thinking around updates to just thinking around persistent identifiers into plans and preparation around updates to strategic systems. So if we're updating collections management, discovery, catalogues, all of those other places where we hold information about our collections, we need to make sure that persistent identifiers can be part of that, can be included and used to cross-reference information that we may hold, not just across our organisation, but with peer organisations as well. As a result of this policy, we have a small working group that's meeting regularly to monitor opportunities to integrate persistent identifiers further. And we'd really welcome people to copy our approach. That's kind of why we made the persistent identifier policy public, and it is indeed one of our recommendations that other organisations should have some kind of persistent identifier policy that frames their thinking and allows them to take the next steps on greater integration of persistent identifiers. We ourselves took a lot away from BNF's persistent identifier policy as well. So luckily we had people who were fluent enough in French to help guide us on the content of the British Library's persistent identifier policy as well. So one of the other resources that I'll just highlight to support decision making across the sector are some videos. So I've just put a still in here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go away and play it, but there is a link there and I can post lots of links into the chat when I'm done talking. But these are very short. The longest one is 3 minutes 15, and we have some shorter really kind of social media shareable videos as well that highlight some of the benefits of persistent identifiers. And we really hope that these high level, short and hopefully snappy videos will be useful in speaking to senior stakeholders on what can be a very dry subject. I mean, we love persistent identifiers at the BL, but we know that that love is not necessarily shared in terms of it being an exciting thing to talk about. So we produced all of these resources, and what we wanted to know towards the end of the project is whether they had yet had any impact. Some of them had only been up a matter of months before we put out our final end of project survey. But actually it turns out that of the people who did respond to the survey, half of them had used some of the materials already. And all of the resources that they had used, they found to be useful. The persistent identifier demonstrator that Rob Page created for us was particularly useful. And we had some really nice kind of free text feedback complimenting us on the work we've done in promoting and disseminating information about persistent identifiers in the sector. So actually we feel like we've done some great work there, that it was taking traction. I think our concern is always going to be at the end of the project, whether we keep that up, and I will come to that with our recommendations towards the end. So starting off to begin those recommendations, we couldn't achieve everything. So these really do address actions for the next and future phases of Towards the National Collection. And firstly, we want to be able to approach persistent identifiers in the sector with some kind of consensus so that we can derive more benefit. And this does not mean we all have to agree on the one persistent identifier that we all have to use. There is a reason we haven't been able to agree that up to this point. But we can have common principles and common functionality across whatever type of persistent identifiers we agree to use. Our needs are not exactly identical. Our data structures internally have lots of historical and structural inertia behind them. And so actually, if we can agree a common set of principles across the sector, lots of which we hope will be driven by the developing identifiers resource, actually that will still move us in the right direction, and we'll be able to do a lot more linking across institutional silos than we can now. We also need to work, on to the next slide, with system vendors to help us along that path as well. So we need to ensure what they're providing to us in terms of how we manage information about our collections can meet those community principles when it comes to persistent identifiers. The way current use of persistent identifiers in our case studies has come about has made it impossible to really look at the costs of implementation up to this point, but we're hoping as more folks start to develop work that includes identifiers, actually maybe we can start to monitor that more closely now and do a bit more cost work on the costs of implementing persistent identifiers, but then perhaps also the benefits we get from the use as we go along. And as part of that, obviously, I mentioned we really want to see more policies in place across more organisations about use of persistent identifiers, and hopefully some of those common principles will start to rise to the top as we see more policies as well. The last thing I haven't already mentioned here is shared infrastructure approaches. Although I say that and I realise there's something I should have said earlier and I can say now. But shared infrastructure approaches, no matter how easy it may be to integrate persistent identifiers in existing technical infrastructure, smaller organisations in some cases do not have any digital or technical infrastructure really to make digital collections available. And so before you even think about persistent identifiers, you need some kind of shared infrastructure or a way that digital content from smaller organizations who might just be, 1.5 or even 0.5 of an FTE can actually share their content, because PIDs isn't even a conversation until they can do that, really. And the ones that I neglected to mention earlier around the developing identifiers resource is that it's all up on GitHub through the simple site. We encourage people to do pull requests and suggest updates, provide us with information that we can update in terms of case studies, etc., because we want that to be a live resource. We've seen that it's been useful now. We want to continue to support people. And so that shouldn't just kind of shrivel up and die now that the work's finished. We've put it out there for us to update, but also for anyone to help with that as well, should you be interested. And so those are the recommendations that made it into the report, but I just wanted to highlight 3 things that we learnt that's maybe not obvious from the report. We found that our colleagues were very willing to listen and take recommendations back to their organisations, and were keen to see what they could do to make use of persistent identifiers. And again, it's getting the buy-in and the traction with that work that the wheels slightly slip on a little bit. Colleagues are really keen to be able to use the power of persistent identifiers to see collections in the wider context, in the context of a national collection, how it links to content, not just in other organisations in the UK, but internationally, and also through systems like Wikipedia and Wikimedia. And, our topic was of international interest, so we always had non-UK folks along to our webinars when we held them, because there is a lot of interest outside the UK on this as well. So where do we go from here? Well, I guess one challenge that we will continue to face is that as persistent identifier use becomes part of the everyday, if it's already built into a system and if it just works, it becomes invisible. But equally, when it breaks, people suddenly realize that it exists. So, you know, people will potentially start to talk about persistent identifiers less until they stop doing what they're there to do. And actually, any attempt to pull together distributed information needs trustworthy links. So you can't go around having broken links all the time, because an organization will say, I was connecting to things in the British Library, now none of their links work. I am not going to bother reconnecting them because they'll just break again. So people really need to have trust in your links if they're going to link to your information. And finally, as well as our developing identifiers, resource pidforum.org is a friendly persistent identifier community willing to answer any questions that anyone may have, technical or even, you know, really high level basic questions as well. They're really friendly, so do pop over there if you have any questions. My final slide is just to say thank you really to everyone. To Lorna Mitchell at Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, and Joe Padfield at the National Gallery, who are co-Is, Professor Rod Page at University of Glasgow, who is the final co-I. Thanks also to Jack Kirby at Science Museum and Matt Woodburn at Natural History Museum, and Richard Palmer at the V&A. Thanks to the AHRC and to the TANK programme for supporting the project and helping us with getting all the content out there. Everyone who attended, spoke at our sessions, responded to surveys. It's been great having you along for the journey. And finally, a quick thank you to Francis Madden, who was the research associate on the project, who, yeah, without whom this would be half the project it was. So yeah, that's me, thank you. And I've forgotten to add the link to the final report on my last slide, but I'm sure we can share it in chat. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Rachel. That was great to hear about that program again, and you'll be glad to know that it appears in pretty much every presentation I do in terms of an example of how the sector could work together in the future on common standards. We've had a few questions come in on the chat. I'm going to go first of all to our fairy godmother, Josie from the Heritage Fund, who wishes to grant, I don't think money comes with this wish, just to caveat that. She'd like to grant a wish to each of our speakers to nominate one of their recommendations. If they could choose just one thing that would absolutely definitely be implemented from what you're recommending, what would it be? And if you want to prioritize someone else's recommendations, she's happy with that too, but you each get one wish. Has anyone, perhaps the two of you who might have been monitoring the chat while Rachel was speaking, have either of you come up with your wish?
Well, given that we're in the realms of sprinkling fairy dust, can we assume that our entire national collection is both catalogued and digitally available in some form? As
it's Friday afternoon, why not?
Clearly that's an enormous piece of work, but until we have some kind of digital something, then we're stuck. But at that point, I'm going to support Rachel and the need for standards, because once you've got those standards in place to identify everything, the world is your oyster, and whatever approaches you bring. And I noticed we had one question about not being too UK centric, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of that because it's one for Gethin to answer, I think. But once you've got something, you can build onto it, you can link, you can add contradictions and ambiguities and point out knowledge that we don't know and knowledge that we may never know, but you need something to begin with. So yeah, standard ways of interactions between once we've got it all digitized, please. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Pressure's on the other two. Do you select one of your own recommendations or somebody else's? Gethin, what do you think?
Yes, you know, I'd also go along with the implementation of persistent identifiers, actually, because, you know, in terms of our project, once you have that stable infrastructure, you can build on top of that using audience motivation. And so we were working much more on the user side of things. And there is a need for that to drive, for example, persistent identifiers and engagement with those, like we saw, you know, in the research use case with what Rachael explained very well, and elsewhere too. So,
thank you. And Rachael, what wish do you want granted?
I guess I'd echo Pip's real kind of long shots in terms of Magic Fairy Dust around actually just having everything digitally available and catalogued and up there. I think that's part of where my comment around actually needing shared infrastructure for the smaller organisations, because the danger is once you start to link all of this content, you can have big organizations with big collections connecting to each other, and the little folks get missed out in that, basically. So I think there are lots of benefits, but you've got to be aware of the problems and the biases that you actually end up enhancing through well-connected content as well. One of the things that I think relates back to engaging crowds that we didn't really get to address in the project is how we can use these connections to better link to community descriptions of the collections that we have and context that we just don't hold in the collections organizations. And actually, if we could also use persistent identifiers to connect to that and have different perspectives and views on our collections, that would be a big wish from me as well.
Great.
Am I allowed to jump in and thank Rachael for pointing to one of the discovery projects that's part of TANK as well? Our Heritage, Our Stories, which is exactly linking community-generated digital content to the larger national collections to get exactly that richness that Rachel's just described.
Great. Well, I'm pleased to be able to tell you that I do actually have a meeting with the fairy godmother in London in a couple of weeks, so we will reflect on your wishes. Moving now to Andy's question, which we referred to earlier about the broader global narrative. Andy, do you want to speak, or do you want me just to read out the question? If I don't hear from you, I'll read it out.
He wanted to be read.
Okay. So Andy Corrigan is saying, how would this, he was writing this when Gethin was speaking, how would this work when our heritage incorporates a broad global narrative? I'd be concerned about something that restricts the concept of UK heritage to locations only within the UK. So Gethin, what are your world domination ambitions?
So the first thing I should say is that our tools will apply beyond the UK. You know, you can visualize your data through our mapping interface for any area of the world. Similarly, you can create geospatial data using Oligo for any area of the world. Secondly, we also had a case study in our project, which was early. You might have seen the slide at the end there briefly, which was coins, early Egyptian coins in Northern Europe. So we did also then apply these tools beyond the UK. Having said that, there are reasons why we did have a lot of a UK focus. Firstly, many of our partners produced statutory historic environment data sets that are limited to the UK. And secondly, have run visitor sites that are predominantly in the UK. And so we use those as a kind of gazetteer for making as a backbone through which we can make links to objects, GLAM objects. And so but that's not to say that you couldn't substitute another, taking our approach, you couldn't substitute another gazetteer, you know, like a sample of geonames, like World Historical Gazetteer, to replace that historic environment data set we used. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Gethin. We've got another question for you from Ian Watson, who says maps are so important and fascinating. He enjoyed your presentation, but he kept thinking about what 3 words, the web app. Have you looked at anything like that?
Yes, GeoNames API has a what 3 words, the ability to query according to what 3 words, and where cultural heritage data sets are mapped to what 3 words already, we are, we would probably then go ahead and make that transition from what 3 words to a coordinate system. And using the centroid of the what 3 words polygon. My understanding of what 3 words is that the main advantage is that you can, rather than like having to say, oh yeah, I'm going to a cafe, if someone says, where is it? You say it's at 74.316, 0.004. Okay, so instead of that, you can use a set of 3 words to represent a small geographical unit. I think it's 10 meters by 10 meters. And so, yeah, where cultural heritage data sets are already mapped to that would be, that's useful, for example, in citizen research projects, where people may be able to map their data to what 3 words rather than coordinates.
Thank you, Gethin. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to read the latest question that's come in. It's about data standardization. It's TG. I'm not sure who TG is, but he's acknowledging difficulties. Oh, it just disappeared. Difficulties in funding data standardization initiatives. And can this issue be presented to funders to review policy and funding priorities? So thank you, Tanya. It's Tanya Gray as TG. I suppose I can attempt to answer that, in that obviously this is something of great interest towards the National Collection, and all the research you've been hearing about today is helping to inform what we want to argue for in future in terms of a future infrastructure, what should be funded, what would be needed. And I think it's absolutely clear that this kind of elements of data standardization, tools, all different things are going to be needed to bring some common approach to collections. But I'm looking at Javier here to see whether he'd like to give a more informed view on that subject.
Yes, so I think that the challenge is the, I mean, well, what everybody has been mentioning, especially you, Rachel. So what we need for an infrastructure to host, I'm thinking even in between persistent identifiers and persistent URIs. So what is that minimum requirement of tools that we need to have organizations starting? What is the bare minimum that we need for them to actually host some sort of data model that enables them to present some content? So, but yeah, so that's one of the big challenges that we have of identifying what is the bare minimum of leveling up, the bare minimum of data, and the bare minimum of knowledge that staff and connection need to make. But yeah, that I think for me at this stage seems like persistent identifiers, or the persistent identifiers could be the goal of the leveling up where we need to reach at as the bare minimum of infrastructure that we need. I mean, that's the bare minimum at least.
Thank you, Javier. Has anybody else got any questions? I think I've picked up everything from the chat. Any of the speakers got questions for each other? No? Okay, thank you, Ian, for coming in on the chat. Just hold a sec. Gethin, this one's for you. The possibility of linking geo-referencing of data to where usage and users come from. Have you looked at that?
Possibility. If I understand the question correctly, I'd say that one of our aims with our web mapping interface was to make it easily deployable by cultural heritage organizations of different sizes. And because of that, we opted for this front-end only interface model where you can host it on GitHub pages. Now, that does, on the other hand, that does mean that you can't, you know, as there's no back end, there's no database, if you like, you can't store any contributions in the web map interface. But from my perspective, I think that's good. That's fine, because it's a very specific use case we're trying to address with that interface. We're trying to address this discovery of web pages, serendipitous discovery, whatever, generous interface of web pages, so people can click through to those web pages. It's that specific use case, and we want to do that well with the interface, rather than and for a broad range of users, those that not only ones that are highly motivated in relation to cultural heritage, but people that are perhaps not so motivated in relation to cultural heritage, but are interested, for example, in their local area. And so we didn't want to have too many features in the single interface. I would say that, but I'm not absolutely sure that's answered your question. I think you might be talking about the linking, creating linked data.
Okay, thank you.
Anyway.
Yep. Any other questions? If not, I'm going to give you a special Friday bonus of finishing 3 minutes early. But I can take another question if anyone's after it.
I had a question for
go
Rachel.
Gethin. Yep.
Rachel, I was just wondering about interfaces for creating these persistent identifiers. And, you know, I think you showed, is it Roderick Page, is it? Yeah, and you showed his interface there. I was wondering if there were any other ideas for how we might make it easier for our smaller cultural heritage organizations from an interface perspective, as well as from a kind of data side, database perspective.
Sorry, Gethin, my connection cut out right at the integral part, important part of what your question was.
Yeah, you did send the something came across you. Yes, I thought my question went down badly, but no, it was fine. I was just saying about from an interface perspective, as well as Roderick, you know, Roderick's interface, which had a specific kind of use case. Was wondering if there were other interface ideas, basically, particularly in relation to smaller cultural heritage organizations, for creating persistent identifiers.
For creating persistent identifiers,
or assigning.
Yeah, or assigning them to content, not particularly. So the ideal would be that whatever system you're managing that content in just does it for you. So as a curator, you don't have to really click any buttons. Once you create a record or import a record into your system, that persistent identifier is just created for you. So really those kinds of interfaces weren't considered. I think it's more about the tools for researchers and users, whether you could overlay on your website perhaps. So one example we had is if you are a gallery with a painting of a specific person, that person may well have a Wikidata identifier, for instance. And on your webpage, you could say, actually, all of these other places have information about the person in this painting because there's a book at the British Library, etc. So quite similar to the Heritage Connector work, and actually linking up information on our own websites across those institutional boundaries. But yeah, in terms of actually assigning or creating persistent identifiers for collections, that should be automated as much as possible, really.
Thank you very much. Okay. Javier, while I'm closing up, can you post Rachel's report, the Zenodo link for Rachel's report, please? Thank you. Thank you, George, for asking and reminding us that we said we'd do that. So thank you very much, everyone, for this afternoon. Wonderfully collegiate behaviour on behalf of our speakers, I would have to say. Incredibly mutually supportive there, which is great to see. It's been fantastic working with all the foundation projects, and everything you've all been doing is making such a big contribution to our thinking for the future. So thank you to the three of you. Thank you very much to the audience, and I hope everyone now does have the opportunity to go and grab a little bit of sunshine, maybe an ice cream, and enjoy your weekends. Thank you very much.